The Caribbean Sea has never been a stranger to conflict. For centuries, these turquoise waters have witnessed empires rise and crumble, colonial powers clash for dominance, and revolutionary movements ignite across the islands and coastlines that dot this strategic corridor between North and South America. But what is unfolding right now, in the present hour, in the waters just north of Venezuela, represents something altogether different, something that historians may one day look back upon as a defining inflection point in 21st century American foreign policy. This is not a distant war unfolding on another continent, thousands of miles removed from American shores. This is happening in America's own backyard, and the stakes could not possibly be higher. I'm Jesse Waters, and tonight, we are going to take you inside the most significant military deployment in the Western Hemisphere since American forces stormed Panama in 1989. We are going to explain why the United States has dispatched 15,000 troops, aircraft carriers, guided missile destroyers, and amphibious assault ships to the Caribbean. We are going to examine why President Donald Trump has ordered a full naval blockade of Venezuelan oil tankers, why American forces have already seized vessels off the coast of a sovereign nation, and why the man sitting in the Miraflores Palace in Caracas, Nicolás Maduro, has become, in the eyes of Washington, not merely a political adversary but a designated terrorist, a cartel kingpin, and a direct threat to the safety and security of the American homeland. But more than that, we are going to ask the questions that the mainstream media refuses to confront head-on. Is this really about drugs? Is this truly about stopping the flow of fentanyl and cocaine into American communities? Or is there something much larger at play? A strategic calculation involving oil, geopolitical influence, and the future of an entire continent? The answers are not simple. The implications are profound, and the consequences, depending on what happens in the coming weeks and months, could reshape the balance of power across the Americas for generations to come. On the 16th of December, President Donald Trump issued an order that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles from Washington to Caracas, from Beijing to Brussels. It was an order that, by its very nature, represented a dramatic escalation of American pressure against the Venezuelan government. A pressure campaign that had been building for months, if not years, but which had now crossed into territory that few analysts had predicted. The order was unambiguous: a full naval blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering and leaving Venezuelan waters. This was not a warning. This was not a diplomatic communique designed to apply subtle pressure. This was the deployment of American military might in a manner that left no room for interpretation. From that moment forward, any vessel attempting to transport Venezuelan crude oil that Washington had designated as the financial lifeblood of a regime it considered illegitimate, corrupt, and hostile, would face the full force of the United States Navy. Within days, American forces made their intentions crystal clear. On the 10th of December, helicopters lifted off from the deck of the USS Gerald Ford, the largest and most technologically advanced aircraft carrier ever constructed, and moved to intercept an oil tanker positioned off the Venezuelan coast. The vessel, according to American officials, had been used to transport sanctioned oil from both Venezuela and Iran, two nations that Washington has long sought to economically isolate. The tanker was seized, its cargo was confiscated, and in a moment that captured the boldness of this new American posture, President Trump himself declared to reporters, "I assume we're going to keep the oil." That single sentence, delivered with the characteristic directness that has defined Trump's approach to both domestic and foreign policy, encapsulated the new reality facing Nicolás Maduro and his government. The United States was no longer content to issue sanctions and hope for compliance. It was no longer willing to watch from a distance as Venezuelan oil flowed to markets in China and elsewhere, generating billions of dollars in revenue for a government that Washington considered an adversary. The era of passive pressure had ended. The era of active confrontation had begun. The Venezuelan government's response was immediate and furious. Officials in Caracas denounced the seizure as an act of international piracy. invoking the language of lawlessness and colonial aggression that has long characterized the socialist government's rhetoric toward the United States. They accused Washington of using its military supremacy not to uphold international law, but to violate it, to steal the natural resources of a sovereign nation under the pretext of enforcing sanctions that Venezuela itself had never accepted. But the seizure of that first tanker was only the beginning. In the days that followed, American forces targeted 2 additional vessels and waters off Venezuela's coast. Each operation was executed with precision, each seizure announced with statements emphasizing the legitimacy of American actions under existing sanctions frameworks. And with each passing day, the message from Washington grew louder and more unmistakable. Maduro's government would be starved of its primary revenue source, no matter the cost. To understand how we arrived at this moment, to truly grasp why the United States has deployed such extraordinary resources to confront a nation of 30 million people, we must first understand the man at the center of this crisis. Nicolás Maduro is not a figure who emerged from the traditional corridors of political power. He did not rise through elite universities or established political dynasties. His journey to the presidency of Venezuela is a story of ideology, loyalty, and the careful cultivation of power within a revolutionary movement that has dominated Venezuelan politics for more than a quarter century. Maduro was born in Caracas in 1962, into a working-class family with roots in the labor movement. As a young man, he found work as a bus driver in the Venezuelan capital, a detail that has been repeated endlessly by both his supporters and his detractors, though for very different purposes. To those who celebrate Maduro's rise, his humble origins represent proof that the Bolivarian Revolution truly elevated ordinary citizens to the highest levels of power. To his critics, his lack of formal education and his working-class background are cited as evidence of incompetence, a leader unequipped to manage the complexities of a modern petrostate. But whatever one's opinion of Maduro's qualifications, there is no disputing the path that brought him to power. In the 1990s, Maduro became deeply involved in the political movement surrounding Hugo Chavez, the charismatic military officer who had attempted a coup against the Venezuelan government in 1992 and emerged from prison as a revolutionary icon. Chavez's vision was bold and sweeping, a complete reimagining of Venezuelan society along socialist lines, a rejection of the Washington-backed neoliberal consensus that had dominated Latin American politics, and the creation of what he called 21st century socialism. Maduro attached himself to this vision with fervent dedication. He rose through the ranks of Chavez's movement, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, demonstrating the kind of unwavering loyalty that would define his entire political career. He served in the National Assembly. He was appointed foreign minister, representing Venezuela on the international stage during some of the most turbulent years of the Chavez era. And when Chavez was diagnosed with the cancer that would eventually claim his life, it was Maduro whom he chose as his successor, the man entrusted to carry the revolutionary flame forward. Chavez died in March 2013, and within weeks Maduro assumed the presidency following a narrow electoral victory that was immediately contested by the opposition. From that moment forward, the trajectory of Venezuelan politics would be defined by Maduro's determination to consolidate power, the opposition's increasingly desperate attempts to challenge him, and the slow-motion, economic catastrophe that would eventually drive millions of Venezuelans from their homeland. The Venezuela that Nicolás Maduro inherited from Hugo Chavez was already a nation in crisis. Years of economic mismanagement, combined with the government's heavy dependence on oil revenues, had created structural vulnerabilities that would prove catastrophic when global oil prices collapsed in 2014. But rather than pursue reform, rather than open the political system to alternative voices, Maduro moved in the opposite direction. He tightened his grip on power with a methodical ruthlessness that stunned even those who had followed Venezuelan politics for decades. Over the course of the following years, The Maduro government systematically neutralized every institution that might serve as a check on presidential authority. A new constituent assembly, packed with government loyalists, was created to supersede the elected legislature. The judiciary, long criticized for its lack of independence, became an open instrument of the ruling party, issuing rulings that criminalized opposition activity and provided legal cover for the arrest of political rivals. The Electoral Council, the body responsible for overseeing Venezuelan elections, was stacked with officials loyal to the government. International observers who had once monitored Venezuelan elections were excluded, and when opposition candidates proved too popular to ignore, they were simply barred from running for office. Their names removed from ballots, their movements restricted, their freedom increasingly constrained. This brings us to the 2024 presidential election, an event that would prove pivotal in shaping the current crisis. The opposition, despite years of repression, had managed to unite behind a single candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez. Gonzalez was not the opposition's first choice. That distinction belonged to Maria Corina Machado, a dynamic and fiercely independent political leader who had galvanized millions of Venezuelans with her calls for democratic reform. But Machado had been barred from running by the electoral authorities, her candidacy nullified on charges that her supporters dismissed as politically motivated fabrications. Gonzalez stepped into the breach, carrying the hopes of an opposition movement that believed, perhaps naively, that the sheer weight of public support might finally force a political transition. When Election Day arrived, opposition volunteers stationed themselves at polling places across the country, meticulously documenting the vote count. The tallies they collected told an unmistakable story. Gonzalez had won by a landslide, capturing support from Venezuelans across class lines, across regional divides, across the spectrum of a society desperate for change. But the official results told a different story entirely. The Electoral Council, controlled by government loyalists, declared Nicolás Maduro the winner. The announcement was met with disbelief, then outrage, then a wave of protests that swept across the country. The international community was divided. Some governments recognized Gonzalez as the legitimate victor. Others, including key allies of the Maduro government, accepted the official results. And in the streets of Caracas and beyond, security forces moved to crush any sign of dissent. Maria Corina Machado, the woman who should have been on that ballot, was forced into hiding. The government declared her a fugitive, issuing warrants for her arrest, accusing her of crimes against the state. For months, she remained out of sight, her location unknown, her safety uncertain. But in October, she received news that would thrust her back into the international spotlight. She had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, recognized for what the Nobel Committee described as her struggle to achieve a just and peaceful transition from dictatorship to democracy. The award was a stunning rebuke to the Maduro government, an acknowledgement from the international community that the woman Caracas had declared a criminal was, in the eyes of the world, a champion of human rights. And in December, Machado defied the travel ban that had been imposed upon her, making her way to Oslo to collect the award in person. Standing before the assembled dignitaries, she spoke of her intention to return to Venezuela, a declaration that carried with it the very real possibility of arrest, imprisonment, or worse. The numbers are staggering, almost incomprehensible in their scale. Since Nicolás Maduro assumed the presidency in 2013, close to 8 million Venezuelans have fled their homeland. 8 million human beings. Men, women, children, elderly, professionals, laborers, students have made the wrenching decision to abandon everything they knew, everything they had built, in search of safety, stability, and opportunity elsewhere. This is one of the largest displacement crises in modern history, rivaling the refugee flows that have emerged from war zones in Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. But Venezuela is not a country at war, at least not in the conventional sense. There are no foreign armies occupying its territory, no aerial bombardments reducing its cities to rubble. What has driven nearly a quarter of Venezuela's population into exile is something different. A slow-motion collapse of the economy, the systematic erosion of political freedom, and the grinding daily reality of life under a government that many Venezuelans have come to view as illegitimate, corrupt, and fundamentally indifferent to their suffering. The economic dimensions of this crisis are almost impossible to overstate. Hyperinflation at its peak rendered the Venezuelan currency virtually worthless. Basic goods, food, medicine, household necessities became impossible to obtain for ordinary families. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Businesses shuttered. The infrastructure that had once supported a middle-class lifestyle crumbled under the weight of mismanagement and neglect. And so they left. They crossed into Colombia by the hundreds of thousands, overwhelming border communities that had no capacity to absorb such numbers. They made their way to Peru, to Ecuador, to Chile, to Brazil. They boarded flights to Spain, to the United States, to anywhere that might offer a chance at a different life. The Venezuelan diaspora spread across the globe, carrying with them stories of hardship, loss, and an unshakable hope that somehow, someday, they might return to a country that had been restored to sanity. For President Donald Trump, this exodus is not merely a humanitarian tragedy, it is a direct threat to American security. Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan migrants have made their way to the United States, crossing the southern border, seeking asylum, joining communities across the country. Trump has made these arrivals a central focus of his political messaging, casting them not as refugees fleeing persecution, but as potential criminals, potential threats, potential vectors for the very instability that drove them from their homeland in the first place. In speeches, in social media posts, and official pronouncements, Trump has accused the Maduro government of deliberately emptying its prisons and insane asylums and forcing the inmates to migrate northward. He has alleged, without providing evidence, that Venezuela is actively exporting its criminal population to American shores, and he has framed his aggressive posture toward Caracas as a necessary response to this perceived invasion. A defense of American sovereignty against a hostile foreign government that is, and is telling, waging a form of unconventional warfare against the United States. The stage has now been set. The players have been introduced, the historical context has been established, but we have only begun to scratch the surface of this unfolding crisis. In part 2 of this investigation, we will examine the other dimension of President Trump's campaign against Venezuela, the war on drugs. We will explore the designation of Venezuelan criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. We will investigate the extraordinary claim that Nicolás Maduro himself leads a drug cartel. And we will begin to unravel the complex, often contradictory evidence surrounding the flow of narcotics from South America to the streets of American cities. The questions we will confront are not comfortable ones. Is Venezuela truly a major player in international drug trafficking? Is the Maduro government directly involved in the cocaine trade? And most importantly, does the evidence support the dramatic military response that the United States has now set in motion? The answers may surprise you. Stay with us. The Caribbean has become a hunting ground. In the dark hours before dawn, when most of the world sleeps unaware, American military assets prowl these waters with a singular purpose. Guided missile destroyers cut silent paths through the swells. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging sweep the horizon searching for targets. And somewhere in the chain of command, decisions are being made. Decisions that will determine who lives and who dies on the open sea. I'm Jesse Waters, and we are continuing our investigation into the most significant American military deployment in the Western Hemisphere in over 3 decades. In Part 1, we examine the political dimensions of this crisis, the rise of Nicolás Maduro, the consolidation of authoritarian control in Venezuela, the disputed 2024 election, and the exodus of nearly 8 million Venezuelans from their homeland. We explored President Trump's decision to impose a naval blockade on Venezuelan oil tankers and the seizure of vessels off the Venezuelan coast. But there is another dimension to this confrontation, one that the Trump administration has placed at the very center of its justification for military action. It is the war on drugs, specifically the fight against fentanyl and cocaine. the synthetic and organic poisons that have claimed hundreds of thousands of American lives and devastated communities from coast to coast. According to the White House, Venezuela is not merely a failed socialist state or a source of unwanted migration. It is an active participant in the drug trade, a narco-state whose leadership is directly complicit in trafficking operations that target American citizens. This is a serious accusation, one that carries profound implications for American foreign policy and international law. If true, it would justify extraordinary measures, including potentially the use of military force against a sovereign nation. But is it true? Does the evidence support the dramatic claims being made by the administration, or is something else at play, a strategic narrative designed to provide legal and political cover for actions that have far more to do with oil, geopolitics, and regime change than with stopping drugs from reaching American shores? Tonight, we examine the evidence. We separate fact from rhetoric. And we ask the questions that demand answers. In the lexicon of American national security, few designations carry more weight than the label foreign terrorist organization. An FTO designation is not merely a diplomatic slap on the wrist or a symbolic gesture of disapproval. It is a legal classification that triggers a cascade of consequences, asset freezes, travel bans, criminal penalties for anyone providing material support, and most significantly, the authorization for military action against designated entities and their members. When President Trump designated two Venezuelan criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, he was not simply making a political statement. He was laying the legal groundwork for a military campaign that could extend far beyond traditional law enforcement operations. The two groups named in the designation were Tren de Aragua and Cartel de los Sol, organizations with very different structures, histories, and relationships to the Venezuelan state. Tren de Aragua, which translates roughly to Aragua Train, emerged from the Venezuelan prison system in the early 20s. Like many Latin American prison gangs, it began as a self-protection organization, a means for inmates to survive the brutal conditions of Venezuela's overcrowded and underfunded correctional facilities. But as Venezuela's economic crisis deepened and state institutions crumbled, Tren de Aragua expanded beyond the prison wall. It evolved into a transnational criminal enterprise, with operations spanning multiple countries and involvement in a range of illicit activities including extortion, kidnapping, human trafficking, and drug smuggling. The gang's expansion has been facilitated in large part by the very migration crisis that has scattered millions of Venezuelans across the hemisphere. As refugees moved through Colombia, Peru, Chile, and eventually toward the United States, Tren de Aragua followed, establishing cells in new territories and exploiting vulnerable migrant populations. Reports of the gang's presence in American cities have generated significant media attention, with law enforcement officials describing encounters with members who had crossed the southern border. The designation of Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization was, in many respects, a straightforward application of existing legal frameworks. The gang is undeniably violent. Its activities are undeniably criminal, and its transnational reach makes it a legitimate concern for American security agencies. But it is the second organization named in the designation, Cartel de los Sols, that raises far more complex and controversial questions. Cartel de los Sols, which translates to Cartel of the Suns, is not a traditional criminal organization in the sense that most Americans would understand the term. It does not have a defined membership structure, a clear chain of command, or an identifiable leadership hierarchy. Instead, it is a term that has been used for decades to describe networks of corrupt Venezuelan military officers and government officials who have facilitated the transit of cocaine through Venezuelan territory. The name itself refers to the sun insignia worn on the uniforms of Venezuelan military generals, a symbol of high rank that has become, in the parlance of drug enforcement, synonymous with official complicity in trafficking operations. But here is where the situation becomes extraordinarily murky. Cartel de los Sols is not an organization in any traditional sense. It is a description, a shorthand for a pattern of corruption that has permeated Venezuelan institutions, but does not constitute a cohesive entity with structured leadership. And yet, President Trump has alleged that this amorphous network is not merely a collection of corrupt officials but an organization led by Nicolás Maduro himself. In a post on his Truth Social platform, the president accused the Maduro government of using stolen oil to finance themselves, drug terrorism, human trafficking, murder, and kidnapping. He announced that the Maduro government itself had been designated a foreign terrorist organization, a classification without clear precedent in American foreign policy. The implications of this designation are staggering. If the sitting government of Venezuela is officially classified as a terrorist organization, then every action taken by that government, every order issued, every policy implemented, every official function performed, could theoretically be characterized as terrorist activity. The Venezuelan military, the police, the bureaucracy, all would fall under the umbrella of this extraordinary designation. The Trump administration has also doubled the reward for information leading to Maduro's capture, signaling an escalation in what has become, in effect, a campaign to remove a sitting head of state through a combination of economic pressure, military intimidation, and the promise of financial incentives for betrayal. Maduro's response has been defiant and unequivocal. He has vehemently denied being a cartel leader, dismissing the accusations as fabrications designed to justify American aggression. He has accused the United States of using its war on drugs as a pretext, a convenient excuse to pursue regime change and gain control of Venezuela's vast petroleum reserve. And he has characterized American actions in Venezuelan waters as acts of international piracy, violations of sovereignty that expose the true nature of Washington's intention. The Venezuelan government has called Trump's statements a grotesque threat and accused the American president of seeking to steal the country's wealth. This is language that resonates powerfully within Venezuela and across Latin America, where memories of American intervention remain fresh, and where the specter of Yankee imperialism continues to shape political discourse. Let us step back from the heated rhetoric and examine what the evidence actually tells us about drug trafficking patterns in the Western Hemisphere. This is not a matter of opinion or political interpretation. It is a question of data collected by the very agencies responsible for combating the drug trade, data that paints a picture considerably more complex than the administration's narrative would suggest. Venezuela is, without question, a transit country for illegal drugs. Its geographic position, situated on the northern coast of South America, with extensive Caribbean coastline and proximity to major cocaine-producing regions, makes it an inevitable waypoint for trafficking operations. Corrupt officials, weakened institutions, and vast ungoverned spaces have created opportunities for criminal networks to move product through Venezuelan territory toward markets in Europe, the Caribbean, and to a lesser extent the United States. But here is a critical distinction that often gets lost in the political discourse. Being a transit country is not the same as being a primary source of drugs reaching American shores. The overwhelming majority of cocaine consumed in the United States does not arrive via Venezuela. It arrives through entirely different routes that have little to do with Nicolás Maduro or his government. Colombia remains the world's largest producer of cocaine. Despite decades of American-funded eradication efforts, despite billions of dollars invested in interdiction and alternative development programs, Colombian coca cultivation has remained stubbornly resilient. The cocaine produced in Colombian laboratories must somehow reach its final consumers in the United States and Europe, and the trafficking organizations responsible for this movement have developed sophisticated logistical networks to accomplish this goal. According to a Drug Enforcement Administration report from 2020, almost 3/4 of the cocaine reaching the United States is estimated to be trafficked via the Pacific Ocean. This is not a minor detail. It fundamentally undermines the premise that Venezuela represents a central node in the cocaine supply chain, threatening American communities. The primary trafficking corridor runs along the Pacific coast of Central America, with cocaine moving by boat, by submarine, and by other maritime conveyances toward staging areas in Mexico and Guatemala before crossing into the United States by land. The Caribbean route, the route that would most directly involve Venezuelan territorial waters, accounts for a significantly smaller percentage of cocaine entering the United States. This is not to say that Caribbean trafficking is insignificant or that enforcement efforts in that region are unwarranted, but it does raise serious questions about why the largest American military deployment in the region since 1989 is focused on waters that represent, by the government's own assessments, a secondary trafficking corridor. And then there is fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that has become the deadliest drug crisis in American history. Fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin. It can be manufactured in clandestine laboratories using precursor chemicals that are relatively easy to obtain. And it has become the primary driver of opioid overdose deaths in the United States, claiming tens of thousands of lives annually in devastating communities across the socioeconomic spectrum. President Trump has made fentanyl a centerpiece of his drug enforcement messaging. On December 15th, he signed an executive order designating fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, arguing that it was closer to a chemical weapon than a narcotic. This is dramatic language, designed to convey the severity of the crisis and to justify extraordinary measures in response. But here is what the executive order does not mention. Fentanyl is produced primarily in Mexico. The precursor chemicals used in its manufacture come largely from China and India. And fentanyl reaches the United States almost exclusively via land routes through the southern border, not by boat through the Caribbean, not through Venezuelan waters, and not in any manner that would be affected by naval operations off the coast of South America. The D-2025 National Drug Threat Assessment does not mention Venezuela as a country of origin for fentanyl smuggled into the United States. This is not an oversight. It is a reflection of the actual trafficking patterns that D-analysts have identified through years of investigation, intelligence collection, and interdiction operations. Venezuela simply does not factor into the fentanyl supply chain in any meaningful way. This creates a profound disconnect between the administration's rhetoric and the underlying reality. If the primary justification for military action is stopping fentanyl from reaching American communities, then deploying naval assets to the Caribbean makes little operational sense. The drugs are not coming from that direction. The trafficking organizations responsible for fentanyl distribution are not based in Venezuela, and the interdiction of maritime vessels in Caribbean waters will do virtually nothing to reduce fentanyl availability on American streets. What happens when rhetoric meets reality on the open ocean? The answer, as the world is now witnessing, is deadly. In recent months, United States forces have carried out more than 24 strikes on boats in international water. These vessels were alleged to have been carrying drugs, cocaine, according to official statements, though the administration has at various times invoked the specter of fentanyl as well. The strikes have killed more than 100 people, human beings whose deaths occurred not in courtrooms following trials, not in prisons following convictions, but on the open sea, at night, often without warning. The Trump administration has justified these operations under a legal framework that is, to put it charitably, novel. Officials argue that the United States is involved in a non-international armed conflict with the alleged drug traffickers. They contend that these traffickers are conducting irregular warfare against the United States, and that the strikes represent legitimate military action against enemy combatants. The administration has described those on board the targeted vessels as narco-terrorists, a term that conflates drug trafficking with terrorism, and implies that the individuals killed were participants in armed hostilities against the United States. This framing is crucial because it is the legal foundation upon which the entire campaign rests. If the people on these boats were terrorists engaged in warfare, then killing them without warning, without arrest, without trial, might be defensible under the laws of armed conflict. If they were not, if they were simply criminals, or even innocent people in the wrong place at the wrong time, then these strikes would constitute something very different. Legal experts have raised profound concerns about the legality of these operations. Many have argued that the strikes are not against lawful military targets as defined by international humanitarian law. Drug trafficking, however destructive its consequences, is not warfare. Drug traffickers, however violent their methods, are not enemy combatants entitled to be killed on sight. The proper response to criminal activity, even serious criminal activity with international dimensions, is law enforcement, not military strikes. One incident in particular has drawn intense scrutiny. On September 2nd, a vessel was hit initially, and survivors of that first attack were subsequently killed in a second strike. This pattern, the deliberate targeting of survivors, raises the most serious possible questions about the nature of these operations. Under the laws of armed conflict, even legitimate military targets are entitled to certain protections once they have been rendered incapable of fighting. The wounded must be treated humanely. Those who surrender must be taken prisoner. The deliberate killing of survivors is under virtually any legal framework a war crime. A former chief prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, speaking to the BBC, characterized the American military campaign as falling into the category of a planned, systematic attack against civilians during peacetime. This is an extraordinary statement, one that suggests the American operations may constitute not merely violations of international law, but crimes against humanity. The White House has rejected such characterizations. Officials have stated that the United States acted in line with the laws of armed conflict to protect America from cartels trying to bring poison to our shores, destroying American lives. This is the language of self-defense, the language of necessity, the language that nations have always used to justify the use of force. Whether it will withstand legal scrutiny remains to be seen. In September, President Trump addressed military leaders directly regarding these operations. He described the boats being targeted as stacked up with bags of white powder that's mostly fentanyl and other drugs, too. But as we have already established, the claim that fentanyl is being transported by boat through the Caribbean contradicts the government's own intelligence assessments. If the boats are indeed carrying drugs, they are almost certainly carrying cocaine, a serious matter, but one that does not match the rhetoric about weapons of mass destruction and existential threats to American life. And there is another uncomfortable reality that must be confronted. While the early strikes were concentrated in the Caribbean, the waters closest to Venezuela, and most directly connected to the administration's narrative about Maduro, more recent operations have shifted focus to the Pacific Ocean. This shift suggests that operational commanders may recognize what the data has long shown: the Pacific is the primary cocaine trafficking corridor, not the Caribbean. But if that is the case, then the massive naval deployment in Caribbean waters begins to look less like a counter-narcotics operation and more like something else entirely. 15,000 troops. Aircraft carriers including the USS Gerald Ford, the largest warship ever constructed. Guided missile destroyers, amphibious assault ships, helicopters, fighter jets, support vessels, intelligence assets. This is the force that the United States has assembled in the Caribbean Sea, ostensibly to combat drug trafficking. It is the largest American military deployment to the region since Operation Just Cause, the 1989 invasion of Panama that toppled Manuel Noriega and resulted in the deaths of hundreds, by some estimates thousands, of Panamanian civilians. The comparison is not incidental. Military analysts have noted for weeks that the scale of the current deployment far exceeds what would be necessary for a counter-narcotics mission. You do not need 15,000 troops to intercept drug boats. You do not need the world's largest aircraft carrier to seize oil tankers. The capabilities being assembled in the Caribbean are not calibrated for interdiction. They are calibrated for invasion. This assessment has been reinforced by statements from administration officials. When asked directly whether American troops might be deployed on the ground in Venezuela, the White House press secretary declined to rule out the possibility. There's options at the president's disposal that are on the table, she stated, without elaborating further. This is the language of deliberate ambiguity, the language of keeping options open, the language that precedes military action while maintaining plausible deniability. President Trump himself has confirmed that he spoke with Nicolás Maduro by phone on November 21st. While the president did not publicly reveal the contents of that conversation, Reuters news agency reported that Trump gave Maduro a one-week ultimatum to leave Venezuela, along with his close family. According to Reuters, Maduro was offered safe passage, an opportunity to flee into exile before whatever came next. He did not accept. One day after that deadline expired, President Trump declared the airspace around Venezuela closed. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States has declared the airspace of a sovereign nation closed, not Venezuelan airspace as Caracas defines it, but as Washington demands. This is an assertion of authority that goes beyond sanctions, beyond blockades, beyond even the aggressive naval posture. It is a claim that American military power extends over Venezuelan skies, that American commands supersede Venezuelan sovereignty, that the United States will determine what flies and what does not over another country's territory. Trump has also threatened to take action against Venezuelan drug traffickers by land. He has not specified what such an operation would look like, how it would unfold, or what its objectives would be. But the implication is unmistakable. American boots on Venezuelan soil is not a theoretical possibility, but an active consideration within the highest levels of the administration. The drug war narrative has now been examined. We have seen how the evidence regarding trafficking routes contradicts the administration's claims. We have explored the legal questions surrounding strikes that have killed more than 100 people on the high seas. And we have confronted the reality that the military deployment in the Caribbean far exceeds any conceivable counter-narcotics requirement. But if drugs are not the true motivation for this unprecedented military posture, then what is? In part 3 of this investigation, we turn to what may be the real prize: oil. Venezuela possesses the largest proven crude oil reserves on the planet, a geological inheritance that has shaped its politics, its economy, and its relationship with the world's great powers. We will examine who is buying Venezuelan oil, why China has become Caracas's most important economic partner, and whether the Trump administration's aggressive stance is ultimately about energy security, not drug enforcement. We will also explore the dangerous game of geopolitical chess being played out in the Caribbean, a game in which Venezuela is not merely a target but a proxy, a theater in which larger conflicts between great powers are being contested. The implications extend far beyond Caracas, far beyond Washington, to Beijing, to Moscow, and to a global order that may be shifting before our eyes. The stakes could not be higher. Stay with us. Beneath the surface of Venezuela lies a treasure that has shaped the destiny of nations, fueled industrial revolutions, and sparked wars that have redrawn the maps of continents. It is oil, black gold, liquid power, the lifeblood of the modern global economy. And Venezuela possesses more of it, according to United States government assessments, than any other nation on Earth. I'm Jesse Waters, and we are continuing our investigation into the unfolding confrontation between Washington and Caracas. In Part 1, we traced the political trajectory that brought Nicolás Maduro to power, and examined the authoritarian consolidation that has defined his rule. In Part 2, we scrutinized the drug war justification for American military action and found it wanting, contradicted by the government's own data on trafficking patterns and undermined by the scale of a deployment that far exceeds any counter-narcotics requirement. Now we turn to what many analysts believe is the true prize in this high-stakes confrontation: energy. Venezuela's oil reserves represent not merely an economic asset but a strategic resource of global significance. Control over that oil, or denial of that oil to adversaries, could reshape the balance of power in ways that extend far beyond the Caribbean, far beyond the Western Hemisphere, to the great power competition that will define the 21st century. Tonight, we follow the oil. We trace the tankers. We examine the buyers, and we ask the question that Nicolás Maduro has posed to the world. Is this really about drugs and democracy, or is it about stealing Venezuela's wealth? Venezuela's relationship with oil is a story of promise betrayed, of abundance transformed into curse, of a resource that should have built a prosperous nation, but instead became the foundation for dysfunction, corruption, and ultimately collapse. Understanding this history is essential to grasping why oil remains so central to the current crisis, and why the struggle over Venezuelan petroleum extends far beyond simple questions of profit and loss. The discovery of massive oil deposits in Venezuela in the early 20th century transformed a relatively poor agricultural nation into one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. For decades, Venezuelan oil flowed to markets around the world, generating revenues that funded infrastructure, education, and a growing middle class. Caracas became a modern metropolis. Venezuelan professionals were educated at the finest universities, and the country seemed poised to join the ranks of developed nations, its future secured by the geological accident that had placed such vast reserves beneath its soil. But oil wealth is a seductive and dangerous thing. It creates incentives that distort economies, corrupts institutions designed to check government power, and breeds a dependency that makes diversification difficult and reform politically costly. Venezuela became what economists call a petrostate, a nation whose entire economic and political system revolves around the extraction and sale of a single commodity. When oil prices were high, Venezuelan governments spent lavishly, distributing revenues through social programs, subsidies, and patronage networks that bought political loyalty but did nothing to build sustainable economic foundations. When oil prices fell, those same governments found themselves unable to meet the expectations they had created, unable to fund the programs upon which millions had come to depend, and unable to adapt to a world in which their primary source of wealth was suddenly worth far less. Hugo Chavez rode this dynamic to power. He came to office in 1999, promising to use Venezuela's oil wealth for the benefit of ordinary people, rather than the corrupt elites who had, in his telling, stolen the nation's birthright. His social programs, the famous Bolivarian missions, provided healthcare, education, and subsidized food to millions of poor Venezuelans. His rhetoric celebrated the revolutionary potential of oil as a weapon against imperialism, a tool for building socialism, and a means of challenging American hegemony in Latin America. But Chavez's model depended entirely on high oil prices. When those prices collapsed in 2014, the system he had built collapsed with them. The social programs could not be sustained. The subsidies could not be maintained, and the economic distortions that had accumulated over years of mismanagement, price controls, currency manipulation, nationalization of private businesses, came home to roost with devastating consequences. Nicolás Maduro inherited this catastrophe. He did not create the structural vulnerabilities that made Venezuela so dependent on oil revenues, but he has proven utterly incapable of addressing them. Under his leadership, oil production has continued to decline, falling from over 3 million barrels per day at its peak to roughly 900,000 barrels today. Infrastructure has deteriorated, skilled workers have fled, and the revenues that once funded government operations have dwindled to a fraction of their former levels. Here is the extraordinary paradox at the heart of Venezuela's current situation. The country with the world's largest proven crude oil reserves produces less than 1% of global output. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, Venezuela accounted for just 0.8% of global crude oil production in 2023, a staggering underperformance for a nation sitting atop an estimated 303 billion barrels of recoverable petroleum. These reserves dwarf those of Saudi Arabia, which has long been considered the world's oil superpower. They exceed those of Russia, of Iraq, of Iran, of virtually every other petroleum-producing nation on the planet. In a world that still runs on fossil fuels, despite the much-discussed energy transition, Venezuela's geological inheritance represents strategic wealth of almost incalculable value. but reserves in the ground are not the same as oil in the marketplace. Extracting Venezuelan crude, particularly the heavy oil found in the Orinoco Belt that accounts for the bulk of the country's reserves, requires sophisticated technology, massive capital investment, and technical expertise that the Maduro government simply does not possess. Years of underinvestment, combined with the exodus of skilled petroleum engineers and the departure of international oil companies that once partnered with the state-owned PDVSA, have left Venezuela's oil industry a shadow of its former self. The sanctions imposed by the United States have compounded these challenges. American restrictions have made it difficult for Venezuela to access the equipment, parts, and services needed to maintain aging infrastructure. They have deterred international companies from investing in Venezuelan operations, and they have complicated the financial transactions necessary to sell oil on international markets, forcing Caracas to rely on intermediaries, discounted prices, and creative arrangements to monetize whatever production it can sustain. And yet, despite all these obstacles, oil remains the Maduro government's primary source of foreign revenue. Profits from the petroleum sector finance more than half of the government's budget. Without oil income, the state would be unable to pay salaries, fund security forces, import essential goods, or maintain the patronage networks that sustain political loyalty among key constituencies. Oil is not merely important to the Venezuelan government, it is existential. This is why the American blockade represents such a devastating escalation. By interdicting oil tankers and seizing vessels carrying Venezuelan crude, the United States is attacking the financial foundation of the Maduro regime. It is attempting to strangle the government economically, to deprive it of the resources necessary to function, to create conditions under which the regime might collapse from within or become vulnerable to pressure from without. The strategy is not subtle. It is, in fact, quite explicit. And when President Trump told reporters, "I assume we're going to keep the oil," he was articulating something that his critics have long alleged. That American policy toward Venezuela has always been, at its core, about controlling access to petroleum resources. If the United States has become Venezuela's most determined adversary, China has emerged as its most important economic partner. Understanding this relationship is essential to grasping the geopolitical dimensions of the current crisis, and to recognizing that the confrontation in the Caribbean is not merely a bilateral dispute between Washington and Caracas, but a proxy conflict in a much larger struggle between great powers. China is by far the largest buyer of Venezuelan oil. As American sanctions have cut off traditional markets and deterred other potential customers, Beijing has stepped in to fill the void. Chinese state-owned companies have purchased Venezuelan crude at discounted prices, providing the Maduro government with desperately needed foreign currency, while securing energy supplies for China's massive industrial economy. This arrangement serves both parties' interests. For Venezuela, Chinese purchases represent a lifeline, one of the few remaining channels through which the government can monetize its primary export and generate the revenues necessary to survive. For China, Venezuelan oil represents diversification of supply, a hedge against dependence on Middle Eastern producers, and a strategic foothold in a region that the United States has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. But the relationship goes beyond simple commercial transactions. China has extended billions of dollars in loans to Venezuela over the past 2 decades, financing infrastructure projects, development initiatives, and, most importantly, providing budget support to governments that would otherwise have faced bankruptcy. These loans have typically been structured as oil for credit arrangements, with Venezuela repaying Chinese financing through future petroleum deliveries. The scale of Chinese investment in Venezuela has created what some analysts describe as a debt trap, a situation in which Venezuela owes so much to Beijing that its economic and political independence is compromised. Whether or not one accepts this characterization, There is no disputing that China has acquired significant leverage over Venezuelan decision-making. And there is no disputing that Beijing has a vested interest in the survival of a government that owes it billions of dollars and provides a reliable supply of discounted crude. From Washington's perspective, this Chinese presence in Venezuela represents a strategic threat that extends far beyond the drug trafficking or migration concerns that dominate public discourse. It represents the expansion of Chinese influence into the Western Hemisphere, the establishment of economic relationships that could eventually translate into military or intelligence cooperation, and the erosion of American dominance in a region that has been considered off-limits to great power competition since the Monroe Doctrine was articulated 2 centuries ago. This is the context in which the current confrontation must be understood. When American warships intercept tankers carrying Venezuelan oil, they are not merely enforcing sanctions or combating drug trafficking. They are disrupting the economic relationship between Caracas and Beijing. They are demonstrating that the United States retains the capability to control maritime commerce in its own hemisphere. And they are sending a message to China that its economic expansion into Latin America will not go unchallenged. The Maduro government has explicitly invoked this dynamic in its response to American pressure. Venezuelan officials have accused the United States of attempting to steal the country's oil wealth, a charge that resonates powerfully in a region with long memories of American intervention and resource extraction. They have framed the confrontation as a neo-colonial assault, an attempt by Washington to reimpose the kind of hegemonic control that Latin American nations have spent generations trying to escape. And they have pointedly noted that Venezuela's oil was flowing peacefully to market until the United States decided to intervene. The drugs, the migrants, the alleged terrorism, all of these justifications appeared only after Washington concluded that it could not tolerate Venezuela's economic alignment with China. In this telling, the entire edifice of legal and moral argumentation constructed by the Trump administration is simply a pretext, a cover story for what is at its heart a resource war. The United States government has repeatedly denied that its actions toward Venezuela are motivated by oil. Officials have insisted that American policy is driven by concern for Venezuelan democracy, for human rights, for the welfare of citizens suffering under authoritarian misrule. They have emphasized the drug trafficking allegations, the terrorist designations, the migration crisis. And they have rejected the accusation that Washington is pursuing regime change in order to gain access to Venezuelan petroleum. But there are reasons for skepticism, reasons rooted in history and reinforced by the pattern of American conduct in the current crisis. The history of American intervention in oil-producing nations is well documented and deeply troubling. In 1953, the United States and Britain orchestrated a coup against the democratically elected government of Iran after Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh moved to nationalize the country's oil industry. The operation installed Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose authoritarian rule generated the grievances that eventually fueled the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The consequences of that intervention continue to shape Middle Eastern geopolitics to this day. In Iraq, the 2003 American invasion was officially justified by claims about weapons of mass destruction that proved to be false. Critics argued at the time and have continued to argue that the real motivation was control over Iraqi oil. And once American forces were in control of the oil fields, the pipelines, the export terminals, a very different political reality would emerge. This does not mean that an invasion will occur. There are enormous risks associated with such an operation, not merely military risks, but political and diplomatic risks that could isolate the United States, destabilize the broader region, and create long-term security challenges that would far outweigh any short-term gains. But the capability is being put in place. The option is being preserved. And the rhetoric from the White House has done nothing to rule it out. China is not the only great power with stakes in Venezuela's survival. Russia, too, has invested heavily in the Maduro government, providing diplomatic support, military equipment, and economic assistance that has helped sustain the regime through years of American pressure. Russian involvement in Venezuela dates back to the Chavez era, when Moscow saw an opportunity to cultivate an ally in Washington's backyard. Arms sales brought Russian weapons into Venezuelan arsenals. Energy companies signed agreements to develop Venezuelan oil and gas resources. And Russian officials made clear that they viewed Venezuela as a partner in their broader effort to challenge American global dominance. The relationship deepened under Maduro, particularly as American sanctions intensified. Russia provided loans when international credit markets were closed. It sent military advisors when the regime feared internal threats, and it dispatched strategic bombers to Venezuelan airports in what were widely interpreted as symbolic gestures of support, demonstrations that Venezuela was not alone, that it had a nuclear-armed ally willing to project power into the Western Hemisphere. And it would need to anticipate Russian responses, not necessarily in the Caribbean, but perhaps in Ukraine, in Syria, in the Arctic, or in other theaters where Russian and American interests collide. The confrontation in the Caribbean is not isolated. There are only two recognized exceptions: force authorized by the UN Security Council under Chapter 7, and the inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 in response to an armed attack. The administration has labeled those killed as narco-terrorist, a term designed to evoke the legal frameworks applicable to terrorist organizations. But the designation of someone as a terrorist does not automatically authorize their extrajudicial killing. When American forces seized the oil tanker off Venezuela's coast in December, Venezuelan officials denounced the action as international piracy. This was not mere rhetorical flourish. The administration has also doubled the reward for information leading to Maduro's capture. But it also has significant drawbacks. Economic strangulation inflicts suffering primarily on ordinary Venezuelans, not on the elite circles around Maduro who have access to resources and escape routes. And it would consume American military resources at a moment when threats elsewhere in the world demand attention. We have arrived at the end of this investigation, but not at the end of the story. It has witnessed colonial conquest and revolutionary liberation, the rise of great powers and their eventual decline.